A precious ring and the roast of a chicken are said to have cost the English king Richard the Lionheart his freedom. The Austrian Duke Leopold captured him and handed him over to Emperor Henry VI. The Roman-German ruler put the English monarch on trial, with fatal consequences for Richard's kingdom. England had to pay an exorbitant ransom to free its own king. A devastating economic crisis ensued. This was the breeding ground on which the Robin Hood legend was born. But from the very beginning it was also a propaganda war between what is now England and Germany. To a certain extent, this is still true today. I thought it would be exciting to cover a topic that affects England, Germany, France, the rest of Europe, and the Crusades. I hope you enjoy it as well. Richard made his way home from the Holy Land in 1192. However, almost all ports were barred to the English king as he was in dispute with many European rulers. This was not actually legally permissible as Richard, as a crusader, was guaranteed free passage by the church. The fact that the powerfuls on the continent ignored it shows impressively how little force the Pope's rules regarding the Crusades had in case of doubt. Richard was only just able to make his way to Italy. However, he was shipwrecked in the process. He and his companions were able to save themselves on land, but they were now forced to take the overland route through the Holy Roman Empire in order to reach English territory. The group probably tried to reach Bavaria as a first stop, since the king had familiar connections to the ruler of this dukedom. Theoretically, Richard could have asked for free passage, and some German historians have wondered in the past why he did not do so. My view is this. Richard knew that he had to travel through Duke Leopold's territory, which is in what is now Austria. That latter hated the English king with a passion. It was foreseeable that Leopold would use the information that Richard was in the region to imprison him. The king did not want to take this risk and preferred to travel secretly through enemy territory. By the way, it was Gerard of Wales who coined the name the Lionheart for Richard. He worked as a recruiter for the Third Crusade. The king and his companions therefore disguised themselves as poor pilgrims. On December 21st or 22nd, 1192, the group stopped at a tavern in the village of Erdberg near Vienna, which Henry VI would later describe as a despicable house. The chronicler Otto of St. Blasien describes what happened next. In order to maintain his cover, Richard decided to personally roast the chicken that the group wanted to eat. This was a serving activity and therefore completely out of character for a ruler. The hope was the act would take attention away from the king. However, Richard is said to have forgotten to remove a valuable ring. And a loyal retainer of Duke Leopold, who was on crusade with his liege lord and the English king, recognized the piece of jewelry as the monarch's ring. He was able to identify Richard and hurried off to inform the Duke. Both returned with several armed men. Leopold is said to have laughed at Richard when he saw the English king roasting the chicken in poor pilgrim's clothes. Richard was subsequently imprisoned. English chroniclers describe this scene differently but diligently contradict each other. According to their accounts, Richard was surprised in his sleep, wanted to hand over his sword to the Duke, or refused to be intimidated by the Duke's soldiers. In their depictions, he embraced the ideals of knightly behavior. Otto, on the other hand, endeavored to portray the scene as unflatteringly as possible for Richard. We are probably not allowed to believe either side completely. The only certainty is that shortly before Christmas 1192, the English king was captured near Vienna by a man who hated him. But why did Leopold hate the English king so much? The answer takes us back to the Third Crusade and the siege of Acre. Unfortunately, here we are again confronted with the situation that English and German historians have a fundamentally different perception of what happened. But let's start with what is considered certain. After the death of Frederick Barbarossa and his son of the same name, Leopold was the leader of the remaining German troops on the crusade. After the capture of Acre, he is said to have raised his banner. This was the typical sign that he was claiming part of the victory and thus part of the spoils for himself. However, Richard tore down the Duke's banner himself, or he ordered his men to do so. According to German sources, the English king then had it kicked into the dirt. In such a case, this was not only a rejection of the demand for a part of the fruits of the victory, but also a deliberate insult. Richard was familiar with this, as the French king Philip Augustus had insulted him in the same way shortly before. The chronicler Magnus of Reichersberg therefore considered the king's capture to be justified. Leopold had taken revenge for the insult he had suffered. Not all chronicles describe the handling of the banner as the defamatory act. In one case, it disappeared altogether. Here the story goes as this. Leopold had pitched his tent in the encampment right next to Richard's, thus claiming equal status. The king took his knife and cut the holding ropes to bring it down. The English chronicler William of Newburgh, on the other hand, describes how Leopold was only able to finance his stay in the Holy Land with Richard's money. He therefore had no right to make demands. We can only state at this point, Leopold believed that the English king owed him money and had violated his honor. He therefore took the opportunity to take him prisoner. Leopold had the English king imprisoned in Dürnstein Castle, which today only exists as a ruin. According to Gervasius of Canterbury, who does not mention Dürnstein by name but only speaks of a filthy house, the conditions were harsh. The English king did not even have shoes. He also had to listen to hours of unquotable insults, but there is no other evidence to support this account. The news of Richard's capture spread like wildfire. Leopold and Henry the VI themselves were probably responsible for this. The Duke had informed the Emperor immediately after the capture. We know this because we have a letter from Henry to the French king dated December 28, 1192, in which the Emperor informs the Vienna monarch. In the letter, Henry refers to Richard as a disturber of your kingdom and writes that he knows that this news will bring the French king great joy. As Richard the Lionheart himself was to report years later, Henry was probably right in his assumption. The French ruler visited Henry. Afterwards, the monarch recalled he was burdened with so many shackles that a horse or donkey could hardly carry them, and he himself was asked for relief from imprisonment for a relative of the French king. Whatever Leopold and Henry had expected in response to the imprisonment, the reaction must have surprised them. They were met with sheer horror and contempt for the imprisonment of a crusader. The Pope furiously demanded his release and threatened to ban the Duke from the church. Leopold was indeed to fall victim to this a year later. It was particularly explosive for Henry that many German princes in the north of the empire were, to put it kindly, very unhappy with this development. This should not have come as a surprise to him, as the English king had relatives here. Henry and Leopold therefore came under pressure almost immediately. This probably explains what happened in Regensburg on January 6, 1193. On this day, the emperor and the king met for the first time. However, there was probably no direct communication between the two men. Instead, Leopold merely introduced the English monarch. The original plan was probably that he would also hand Richard over to Henry. But the Duke and the Emperor were unable to agree on a sum that they should demand as ransom for the king. The pressure they were under was probably an obstacle to the talks. Leopold therefore withdrew together with Richard. An agreement was reached in February 1193 in the Treaty of Würzburg. The Emperor and the Duke demanded 100,000 marks of silver by Cologne weight. This meant 23.3 tons silver altogether. Richard was also to submit to Henry and provide military assistance for the forthcoming campaign in Sicily. He had to provide 50 ships and 200 knights for a year as well. The two men agreed to share the sum equally, which was said to be 2 to 3 times the yearly revenue of the English crown at the time. Richard recalled this agreement in a letter to the Pope shortly before Christmas 1194, when he had long been free again. Leopold had sold him to the Emperor as if I were an ox or a donkey, the document states. Richard refused to pay the ransom at the beginning. His brother John, not exactly the hero of the Robin Hood story, served as regent in Richard's absence. He also refused to pay and even joined forces with the French king to offer Henry considerable sums of money in exchange for not releasing Richard. Richard's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, showed more willingness to pay. She sold all the goods that had not already been sold for the Crusade. The English king himself probably also changed his mind on the ransom issue in February or March 1193 and may have come to an agreement with the emperor. At the very least, letters from the two men to the English nobility from this time have been preserved, in which they are urged not to do anything that would offend Richard's honor. This was probably meant to indicate that the ransom was to be paid. However, Henry still had the problem that he was met with great hostility for Richard's imprisonment. The emperor therefore decided to put the English king on trial at the Imperial Assembly of Speyer in March 1193 in order to bring him to justice in a highly publicized manner. Richard reached Speyer on March 22nd, 1193 and was handed over to imperial custody here. One day later, the Imperial Assembly began, at which Richard's fate took center stage. It was a show trial which primarily served to justify the emperor's actions. Henry personally led the prosecution, which was remarkable even for the time, as it was his court. We know the words that the emperor spoke to accuse Richard of various crimes.
I, Henry, by the grace of God, Emperor of the Romans and Eternal Augustus, accuse you, Richard, King of England, of the following serious crimes. You have had murdered Conrad of Montferrat, who was destined to succeed Guido of Lusignan on the throne of Jerusalem. You have neglected your feudal duties to your feudal Lord Philip, the famous king of the French, and even sought his life. You have imprisoned our friend and blood-related Emperor of Cyprus. You made a disgraceful peace with Sultan Saladin and abandoned the Holy Land to the Muslims. You insulted our beloved and blood-related Leopold, Duke of Austria, before the wars of Acre. You caused the kingdom of Sicily to be lost to our rule through an agreement with our enemies. You presumed to be the leader of Christendom. But this is mine alone. Henry, by the grace of God, Emperor of the Romans.
However, Richard knew how to defend himself. This is a speech which I have taken from a work from the 19th century. He is said to have delivered it kneeling before the emperor. I am born in a rank which recognizes no superior but God, to whom alone I am responsible for my actions. But they are so pure and honorable that I voluntarily and cheerfully render an account of them to the whole world. The treaties I have concluded with the King of Sicily contain no infraction of the law of nations. I do not understand how I can be reproached for the conquest of Cyprus. I avenged my own injuries and those of the human race in punishing a tyrant and dethroning an usurper, and by bestowing my conquest on a prince worthy of the throne, I have shown that I was not prompted by avarice or ambition, so much so that the Emperor of Constantinople, who alone had any right to complain, has been wholly silent on the subject. In reference to the Duke of Austria, he ought to have avenged the insult on the spot, or long since to have forgotten it. Moreover, my detention and captivities by his orders should have satisfied his revenge. I need not justify myself against the crime of having caused the assassination of the Marquis of Montferrat. He himself exonerated me from the foul charge, and had I my freedom, who would dare to accuse me of deliberate murder? My pretended correspondence with Saladin is equally unfounded. My battles and victories alone disprove the false assertion. And if I did not drive the Saracen prince from Jerusalem, blame not me, but blame the King of France, the Duke of Burgundy, and the Duke of Austria himself, all of whom deserted the cause and left me almost single-handed to war against the infidel. It is said that I was corrupted by presents from the Sultan, and that I joined the crusade from the love of money. But did I not give away all the wealth I seized in capturing the Baghdad caravan? And what have I reserved out of all my conquest? Nothing but the ring I wear on my finger. Do you then render justice to me, have compassion on a monarch who has experienced such unworthy treatment, and put more faith in my action than in the calumnies of my deadly foes? These words are said to have persuaded Henry to help Richard to his feet and give him the kiss of peace. The emperor, who had previously referred to Richard as an enemy of the empire, forgave him. Historians had long assumed that Henry had registered the hostile mood at the Imperial Assembly. That is why he radically changed his mind. However, Knut Gürich has proposed a different interpretation, which in my opinion is more convincing. It was a deliberate staging by both sides to end the actual dispute. It is fitting that the ransom was described as a compensation payment going forward. The agreements reached beforehand also support this. Richard's Arch-Chancellor, William de Longchamp, travelled back and forth between Richard, the imperial court, and the English dominions in order to bring the negotiations to a successful conclusion. For Richard, however, the emperor's forgiveness was not synonymous with release. First of all, the ransom money had to be paid. Henry also insisted that Richard would take the English kingship from him as a fief. As part of this act, there were to be public humiliation rituals for the English king. Negotiations, therefore, had to continue. During this time, Richard was imprisoned in Trifels Castle, less than 50 kilometers away from Speyer. Burned down in the 17th century, but was restored after the Second World War in the same form as it looked in Richard's days, so we have a good idea of how the king lived. Ralph of Dicito describes the castle like this. It was built to throw people in jail forever who were enemies of the empire. This terrifying look was meant to intimidate Richard. And yet, the news about the prison conditions in Trifels are very contradictory. According to the chronicler William of Newburgh, Richard himself stated that he was treated mildly and with due honor while in prison. The consideration for his rank, which was an obligation at the time, was shown by his guards. The chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall further tells us, "We hear about Richard's guards, that the king joked with them, wrestled with them for fun, and drank them under the table, but also that they accompanied him everywhere day and night, with their swords drawn, even standing around his narrow bed at night, and not allowing any of the men in his entourage to sleep with him." However, a letter from Peter of Blois to Conrad, the Archbishop of Mainz, who was a friend of Peter's from student days, sounds quite different. Richard was being held in heavy dungeon chains and tormented by hunger. His guards were refusing him food. The Archbishop was told to stand up for the English king. Only one of Richard's letters from the time in Trifels has survived. In this document, the king gives instructions on how the ransom should be paid. There are no detailed German reports. So, what can we make of this? It is reported that Richard's imprisonment at Trifels was getting harsher because the English were taking too long to pay the ransom. This was quite common at the time. However, we can no longer trace the intensity of the prison conditions. Both sides had an interest in going to extremes in this respect. The English insisted on a treatment unworthy of a king. The Germans spoke of the opposite. The fact that Richard never complained was probably also due to the fact that he himself was well aware that he was being treated normally. As mentioned in the trial, he had the Emperor of Cyprus imprisoned. He had only surrendered to the English king on the condition that he was not put in iron chains. Richard kept his word and had it imprisoned in silver chains. The English king had 2,600 Muslim men, women and children killed in Acre in August 1191. In a letter to the abbot of Clairvaux, he praised himself for this. He had acted as he should have. It was a time when experienced violence was part of life. Richard was aware of this and did not exclude himself. The harsh prison conditions did not last long. Richard was transferred from Trifels Castle, which was considered impregnable and where the imperial insignia were kept, to the emperor's immediate entourage. Earlier generations of historians interpreted this as a certain paranoia on Henry's part, who wanted to directly control Richard's movements. However, the following actions did not fit in with this interpretation. Henry treated Richard like a king who was a guest. This is evident from letters from the English monarch himself. For example, the emperor gave him gifts. More likely is, Henry must have been rather sure that all conditions would be met. Richard not only received gifts, but was also able to talk to envoys and thus conduct some government business in person again. This also accelerated the negotiations on the final terms of release. There were some changes in this regard at times. Henry, for example, demanded a higher sum in the meantime, but went back to the original number. The condition that Richard had to personally take part in the military campaign to Sicily was dropped. In June 1193, all sides agreed on the Treaty of Release in Worms. In addition to the monetary payment, Richard was to take his kingship from Henry as a fief, kiss the emperor's feet, and pay an annual tribute of £5,000 from then on. Then he was to be released. All of this happened during the Imperial Assembly of Worms on February 4th, 1194. The monarch was then set free. Richard did not return home immediately, however, but first traveled to several German cities. To this day, English historians see the English king as the winner. He had successfully rejected humiliations that were too severe, stating that he would rather die than accept them. He also did not have to follow the army to Sicily. Some German historians, on the other hand, emphasize that there was nevertheless a clear submission and an exorbitantly high sum was paid. Many assessments can be traced back to the chronicler Roger of Horden. He has a problem with trustworthiness, to put it mildly. Some of the news can only be found in his work. For example, he reports that Richard was the one who offered the ransom, which is out of question and frankly ridiculous. He is the only one as well that reported Richard should be crowned King of Burgundy. We should therefore not succumb to the temptation to name a winner. All that matters to us is that an agreement was reached that poured a lot of money into the coffers of the empire. Also, the emperor himself hesitated again at the end, as John and the French king offered him 150,000 marks to hand Richard over to France. However, the German princes made it very clear to Henry that this would not happen. Henry used the money to conquer Sicily. Worms, Speyer and Vienna were given new city walls. Leopold also used the money to build a new city district in Vienna. To this day, English works often state that the money was used solely for the campaign against Sicily. This is not correct. The gigantic ransom payment led to a devastating economic crisis in England. All silver had to be melted down. No silver from the period has survived from the English dominions. A special tax of 25% was introduced. Even the Scottish king and the citizens of Cologne contributed to the gigantic sum. The payment led to a dramatic impoverishment of the population, and was not without reason that the Robin Hood legend was born. However, it was not until the 16th century that it was fused with the return of Richard the Lionheart. By then, people had apparently forgotten that money had been paid for his release. The Blondel legend also originated at this time. A troubadour searches for his captive friend, the English king. I put one verse on the screen. None of the participants in this drama were to live very long. Duke Leopold died on December 31st, 1194, as a result of an injury. This was seen as a judgment from God, especially as Henry VI also departed this world in 1197. Richard the Lionheart, however, died childless in April 1199, and the same as Duke Leopold, as a result of an injury. If God had indeed judged, he was not satisfied with any one of those involved.